It started with silence, the kind that builds like fog in a house that once echoed with laughter. I used to think marriage was built on love and trust, but it took me years to realize that sometimes the person you trust the most can be the one who destroys you from the inside. I met Ryan when I was just 22. He was charming, ambitious, and had this calm voice that made you feel safe, like nothing in the world could go wrong when he was around. I fell for him hard and fast, and when he proposed only 8 months later, I said yes without a second thought. The wedding was small, nothing fancy. Just close family and friends, but my heart felt full, and I believed in our future. I believed in him. The early days were sweet. He brought me coffee in bed. We watched movies wrapped in a blanket. We made love like we meant it, and talked about building a life together. We moved into a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood and started working our way up. He was in finance, I was in marketing, and we both had dreams we wanted to chase, but dreams have a way of fading when reality shows up. Bills kept piling up, work got stressful, and little fights turned into long arguments. At first they were about dishes or laundry or who forgot to buy milk, but slowly they got louder, more personal, sharper than I ever expected. One night, about 3 years into the marriage, we had a fight about money. It was late, we were tired, and I made a comment about his spending habits. It wasn't meant to hurt, but something in him snapped. He stood up, walked toward me with this look I had never seen before, and slapped me across the face. It was not just a slap. It was the moment my world cracked. I froze, my hand on my cheek, heart pounding, thoughts racing. He didn't say sorry. He didn't look shocked. He just stood there, breathing heavy, like he had wanted to do it for a long time. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and cried into a towel so the neighbors would not hear the next morning. He brought me flowers. He said he was sorry. He said work had been stressful. He said he loved me and it would never happen again. And I wanted to believe him, so I did. For a while things went back to normal, or at least what I thought was normal, but something had shifted inside me. I started walking on eggshells, watching my tone, softening my opinions, because I did not want to trigger another outburst, but it happened again. Months later, and then again after that, and each time came with a new excuse, and each time I forgave him because I remembered the man. I married the one who made me laugh, the one who held me when I was sick, the one who told me I was beautiful when I felt anything, but I held on to those memories like a life raft, hoping the storm would pass. But the storm became the climate, and I began to lose myself in it. My friends noticed. They said I looked tired, withdrawn, distant. I stopped going out. I stopped answering calls. I didn't want to explain the bruises or the silence or the way my voice trembled when someone asked if I was okay. I told them I was just busy with work, that marriage was hard, that I was fine. But I was not fine. I was surviving, not living. Then one night everything changed. He came home late, smelling like whiskey and anger. I asked where he had been, and he pushed me against the wall, not with a slap this time, but with force enough to knock the breath out of me. And when I fell to the floor, he stood over me and said, "You made me do this. You always make me do this." I stared at the ceiling, blinking back tears, and something inside me broke, not like a branch, but like a chain. I waited until he passed out on the couch. I cleaned my face. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I did not recognize the woman staring back at me. I saw fear, exhaustion, pain, and something else, something new, something like steel. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, thinking about all the ways I had tried to fix him, all the ways I had blamed myself, all the times I had told myself this was love. It was not love, it was control, and I was done being controlled. I knew I had to be smart, careful, calculated. I started gathering evidence, photos of bruises, copies of medical records, voice recordings. When he yelled or threatened me, I emailed them to a secret account, one he did not know about. I met with a lawyer during lunch breaks, made a plan step by step, day by day. I built my escape like a blueprint. I moved small amounts of money into a separate account, opened a post office box, changed passwords, told only one trusted friend everything, and asked her to be my emergency contact. She cried when I told her, but she promised to help. I still remember the date. I decided to leave. It was a Thursday in late November. The air was cold, the sky gray, and everything felt heavy. I told him I wanted to make him A special breakfast the next morning, just the two of us. I got up early, cooked his favorite pancakes with blueberries, fried eggs, crispy bacon, hot coffee. He sat at the table smiling like nothing was wrong, like he had not turned our home into a battlefield. I poured his coffee and sat across from him. Watching him eat, I was calm, quiet, ready. My heart was beating, but my face showed nothing. He finished his plate, wiped his mouth, leaned back, and said, "You should smile more. You look prettier that way." I stood up, walked to the counter, picked up the envelope with the restraining order, and placed it on table. I said, "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Ryan." He looked confused, then angry, then scared, and before he could say anything the doorbell rang. 2 police officers entered the apartment. I had filed the complaint the night before, submitted all the evidence, signed the documents. They arrested him on spot. He shouted, he cursed, he threatened, but they took him away in handcuffs, and I watched from the doorway, not with tears, not with fear, but with relief. After they left, I closed the door and stood in the silence that used to feel like fog, and now felt like freedom. I walked into the bedroom, packed a bag, and left the apartment for good. I moved in with my friend, stayed with her for 3 weeks while I found a small place of my own, started therapy, joined a support group, began to heal not just the bruises but the parts of me that had forgotten what peace felt like. I went back to work full-time, found joy in little things again: music, books, sunlight through a clean window. I adopted a dog named Milo, and for the first time in years I felt safe. He tried to contact me, of course, letters, calls, even sent flowers. I ignored all of it. I had nothing left to say and nothing left to fear. The court granted the restraining order, gave me full protection, and he was ordered to attend anger management and counseling. I don't know if he changed, and I don't care. What I care about is that I survived, I got out, and I found myself again. This is not a story of revenge. It is a story of justice, of choosing yourself, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. And the breakfast I served him that morning was the beginning of the end, not just for him, but for the version of me that thought love meant pain. It doesn't, and now I know better. After Ryan was taken away and I had left the apartment behind, the days that followed felt like walking through thick fog, not the kind that blinds you completely, but the kind that slows everything down and makes even the smallest step feel heavy. I moved into my friend Ava's guest room, and for the first time in years, I slept without fear of footsteps outside my door or a voice raised in anger. She made me tea, brought me snacks, made sure I was not alone, even when I wanted to be. And at night, I would lie on the small bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling more exhausted than I ever had in my life. I was not just tired, I was drained, emptied, like someone had reached inside me and scooped out everything I used to be. But the silence was different now. It did not haunt me, it healed me. I started journaling again, something I had given up years ago. I wrote about the bruises, the apologies, the cold stares, the broken glass, the silent meals, and the fake smiles. I wrote about how I used to stand in front of the mirror and practice what to say to keep him calm, how I used to flinch when someone raised their hand, even if it was only to wave. And I wrote about the morning I served him breakfast and handed him justice on a plate, and I kept writing every single night like I was piecing myself back together, one sentence at a time. Ava worked late shifts, so during the day I was alone with my thoughts, which was both a blessing and a curse. I cried in the shower, screamed into pillows, then sat still for hours thinking about nothing and everything. I kept wondering how I had let it go so far, how I had allowed someone to take my voice, my joy, my light, and twist it into something I could not recognize. And then I remembered I had not allowed it, I had survived it, and that was not weakness, that was strength. The legal process was not easy, even with all the evidence I had collected. The system moved slow, and I had to retell my story over and over to lawyers, to officers, to judges, each time scraping the wound open again. But I did it because I knew it was the only way to close that chapter for good. The restraining order was granted officially after the second court date, and I could finally breathe a little easier knowing he could not come near me without consequences. I got a job offer from a former colleague who had heard I was back in the job market. She said I was one of the smartest people she had worked with, and that if I wanted the role, it was mine. I hesitated because I still felt like a shell of myself, but Ava pushed me. She said, "You are not who he said you were. You are who you were before him and more." So I said yes. The office was bright, and the team was kind, and the work kept my mind busy, but even as I built new routines, learned new systems, and made new friends, there was always a shadow behind me, like I was still being watched. I took self-defense classes on weekends and bought a personal alarm I kept on my keychain. I started therapy with a woman named Dr. Elaine, who looked like she had seen a lot but never judged. She asked me about the first time Ryan hit me, and I told her everything, even the parts I had hidden from myself. She said healing was not linear, that some days I would feel like I was back at the beginning, and that was okay. I believed her because some days I would wake up feeling free, and other days I would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing his voice in my head, saying things like, "You are lucky I put up with you," or "No one else would ever love you." But the more I talked about it, the less power those words had. I learned to reframe them, to see them and reflections of him, not of me, and I slowly began to believe that I was not broken, just bruised, and bruises fade. I found a new apartment after 6 weeks, a small one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a quiet building with old wood floors and sunlight that poured in through the kitchen window every morning. I bought plants and placed them on the windowsill, named each one after a virtue I wanted to grow back: courage, hope, strength. I painted the walls soft colors, hung art that made me feel something. And for the first time I built a home that was mine and mine alone. I adopted a dog from the shelter, a brown and white mutt with sad eyes and a wagging tail. I named him Milo, and he followed me everywhere, sat at my feet while I worked, licked my face when I cried, and slept beside me every night like he knew I needed him more than anything. One Saturday morning, about 2 months after Ryan's arrest, I received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, no return address, but I recognized the slant of the writing before I even opened it. It was from him. He wrote that he missed me, that he had been going to therapy, that he finally understood what he had done wrong, and he wanted another chance. He said I had changed him, that he was becoming a better man because of me, and he ended the letter with a line that made my stomach twist. He said, if I could forgive him, we could still have the life we dreamed of. I read it twice, then tore it into pieces and dropped it in the trash. I did not respond. I did not cry. I just sat there with Milo's head on my lap and whispered to myself, not anymore, not ever again. Part of me had always feared that moment, feared that he would try to sneak back in with sweet words and hollow promises. But when it happened, I realized I had already closed that door and nailed it shut. I began volunteering at a local shelter for women like me, women who had run from fists and words and fear, some with children, some without, some still shaking, some already fierce. We shared stories not just of pain but of survival, and I saw in them what I had seen in myself, that fire that refuses to die even when it burns low. And I became part of something larger, a network of strength and resilience that gave me back the pieces of myself I had forgotten existed. One day at the shelter, I met a woman named Clara. She was barely 20, barely surviving, with a baby in her arms and a look in her eyes that reminded me of the night I sat on my kitchen floor planning my escape. I talked to her for hours, helped her fill out paperwork, held her baby while she ate her first full meal in days. And when she finally smiled at me, I knew that healing was a circle, that when we lift others, we rise too. Over time, my body healed, my mind healed, my voice returned louder, clearer, and I stopped apologizing for things that were never my fault. I changed my phone number, blocked every mutual contact, changed my locks, bought a new car, and made sure Ryan had no path back into my world. And in the evenings, I would sit on my little balcony with Milo, a cup of tea, and the hum of the city below me. And I felt peace, not joy, not yet, but peace, and that was enough for now. Ava visited often. She brought wine and gossip and laughter, and we sat on the floor like teenagers, telling stories and making plans for trips we might take one day. And she told me how proud she was, how brave I was, and I told her I could not have done it without her, and we cried a little and laughed a lot. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had a future, not just a past. And in quiet moments, I would look at the photo on my fridge, a picture of me and my parents from years ago, before I met Ryan, before the storm, and I would remember who I was. and who I had become, and I promised myself that I would never again let anyone dim that light, because I had fought too hard to reclaim it. The days turned into weeks, and I started to feel the shift inside me like the slow turning of the tide, and while I was far from whole, I was no longer broken in the way I had been before the morning. I served him breakfast and watched him get handcuffed in the hallway. I kept going to therapy every Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock sharp with Dr. Elaine, who reminded me each time that healing is not a ladder, but a spiral. Sometimes you revisit the same pain, but from a new angle, and you are stronger than you were the last time you faced it. She gave me journals and exercises, helped me unlearn the guilt I had worn like a second skin, and piece by piece, I took back my mind, my voice, my sense of worth. There were moments I felt proud of, small victories like walking past someone wearing the same cologne he used without freezing or waking up from a nightmare, and not crying, just breathing through it and reminding myself I was safe now. I had to rewire my instincts because so much of my life had been about surviving, and now I needed to learn how to live again. I started cooking for myself again, not just quick meals, but real food dishes that reminded me of who I used to be. I made my mother's lemon chicken recipe and cried the whole time, not because I was sad, but because the scent reminded me of home, of comfort, of a time when I was loved without being controlled. Ava came over to help sometimes, and we would cook together in my tiny kitchen, music playing too loud, wine glasses full, and laughter bouncing off the walls, and those nights reminded me that joy could return, that love did not always hurt. I still carried the scars, some visible, some buried deep, but I carried them like medals, not as shame, but as proof that I survived. I had to attend a final court hearing regarding Ryan's sentencing, and the thought of seeing him again made my stomach churn. But I went because I wanted to look him in the eye one last time, and show him that he no longer had power over me. I wore a blue dress, the same shade I had worn on our first date, when I still believed he was kind. I stood tall and calm as the judge listed out the charges and announced the sentence: a reduced term due to first offense and good behavior, but followed by mandatory counseling and a permanent restraining order. I looked at Ryan for only a moment, and he looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, older. And I realized that time had started to weigh on him just like it had on me, but in very different ways. He mouthed something I could not hear, maybe sorry, maybe help me, maybe both, but I did not care because that man was a stranger to me. Now I left the courthouse with a clear heart and a steady breath, and I felt like I had finally closed the door on a chapter that had nearly destroyed me. Not long after that I met someone new. His name was Julian, and he worked in marketing for a non-profit. We met at a friend's birthday dinner, and he asked me about my favorite books instead of where I lived or what I did for a living, and when I told him I liked stories about survival, he just nodded and said those are the best ones because they always end with strength. He did not try to fix me or save me. He just listened and offered space. And after a few weeks of quiet conversations and long walks in the park, I agreed to go on a real date with him. We went to a bookstore and then for coffee, and it felt like breathing fresh air after living in a basement for years. I was cautious, slow, unwilling to let my guard down completely, but he never pushed. He just waited with patience I did not know still existed in men, and little by little I let myself feel again, not for him, but for me, because I deserved joy. I deserved connection, not because I had been hurt, but because I was human and healing. One evening, while we sat on my balcony, Julian asked me what had made me finally leave Ryan, and I told him everything. I did not sugarcoat it. I did not cry. I just told the story like it was someone else's history. And when I finished, he did not pity me. He just said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." And in that moment I knew he was different. Milo liked him too, which meant everything to me because dogs have a sense for good people, and mine had been trained by survival. Julian did not fill the silence, he respected it, and when I needed space he gave it, and when I needed company he brought it, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with just his quiet presence. And over time I started to believe that love could be soft, that it could be safe, that it did not have to come with apologies and bruises and fear. I went back to visit my parents for the first time since everything happened, and when I walked through the door, my mother hugged me like she had been holding her breath for years. My father sat me down and said was sorry for not noticing sooner, and I told him it was not his fault that Ryan had been careful, that I had been careful too. And we all cried over tea and photographs and shared memories of the girl I used to be and the woman I had become, and my mother said I had always been strong even when I did not feel it, and that she was proud of me for finding my way back. I showed them photos of Milo and of my apartment and of Julian, and they smiled and said he looked kind, and I said he was. I left that visit feeling like a daughter again, not a survivor, not a case file, not a cautionary tale, just a daughter with roots and love and a future. One day, Clara, the girl from the shelter, called me. She said she had gotten her own place and a job at a diner, and that her baby was walking now, and she wanted to thank me for sitting with her that night when she was too scared to breathe, and I told her she had done all the work herself, that I had only been a mirror reflecting back her strength. And after that we kept in touch, texting once a week, sometimes more, and I realized that helping others helped me heal too, because every time I reminded someone else they were not alone, I reminded myself too. One morning I woke up early, the sun just peeking through the blinds, and I looked around my little apartment at the plants, the books, the framed photos, and I felt peace, real unshakable peace, and I whispered thank you to no one and everyone, to Ava, to Dr. Elaine, to Julian, to my younger self, who had survived the worst and chosen to keep living, and I promised myself that no matter what came next, I would never let fear take the driver's seat again, because I had learned the hard way that love without respect is not love at all, and silence is never safety, and healing is not a destination, it is a daily choice, a daily act of rebellion against the pain that tried to break you, and in choosing to rise again and again, I had already won. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I finally opened the old cedar chest that had been sitting at the foot of my bed for months, the one Ryan never allowed me to keep in our master bedroom, because he said it smelled like my past, and he did not want the old version of me getting in the way of the new obedient one. I had packed it years ago when I moved into our first apartment, a box full of my grandmother's handkerchiefs, photo albums, letters, books, and the blanket my mom crocheted when I was in college. And for some reason I had never unpacked it, maybe because I had learned quickly what things Ryan would allow and what things he would not. I pulled the lid back slowly, and the familiar scent of cedar hit me, and I breathed it in like an anchor to a life that had not been erased. Just buried at the very top was a framed photo of me from 2010, standing in front of my university library wearing a graduation robe and holding my degree with a grin that felt like sunshine. I looked at that girl, and I saw hope and fire and dreams that had not yet been stepped on, and tears rolled down my cheeks, not from grief, but from connection, like I had found a version of myself that had been calling out from behind layers of silence. Beneath that was a leather-bound journal with worn edges, and I flipped through pages of poetry, some mine, some copied lyrics and memories scribbled in quick, shaky handwriting, moments that had once mattered, and I let myself feel every word, because for too long I had been numb, not just to pain but to joy and wonder and beauty. That afternoon I went to the park alone, a place I had not visited since before the marriage, and I brought the journal with me, sat under a tall maple tree, and wrote for hours, not about Ryan, not about the abuse, not about the court case, but about the wind, the smell of grass, the laughter of children playing nearby, and how the sky looked like it had been washed with soft blue paint. I felt alive in a way I had not in years, like I was slowly peeling off someone else's skin and finding my own underneath. I stopped checking the clock, stopped checking my phone, and for the first time in a long time I did not feel watched, I did not feel hunted, I felt present. I took myself to dinner that evening, a small Thai place tucked in a corner of the city where no one knew my name, and I sat by the window with a book and ordered spiciest thing on the menu, and when the waitress smiled and asked if I was waiting for someone, I said no, just me, and it felt powerful to claim that, to not apologize for being alone, to not make excuses or fill the space with lies, just me. I said again in my mind, and smiled because that was enough. Next week I signed up for a pottery class, something I had always wanted to try, but Ryan had said was childish and messy and a waste of money, and I walked into the studio nervous but determined, and the smell of clay and the sound of spinning wheels was oddly comforting, and by the end of the class my hands were covered in earth and my heart was full. The instructor named Marla told me I had a natural touch, and I almost cried because it had been so long since anyone had said something kind to me without agenda. I made a little bowl, imperfect and lopsided, and I loved it because it was mine, and because creating something felt like the opposite of surviving. It felt like thriving. I started saying yes to invitations again, brunches, walks, random bookstore meetups. Ava dragged me to a painting and wine night, and we laughed so hard we cried, and when she accidentally spilled red paint on her jeans, she just shrugged and said it looks like modern art, and I realized how much I had missed just being with someone who loved me without trying to mold me into something else. One night, Julian came over with a bag of groceries and said he wanted to cook for me, and I let him even though every instinct in me wanted to stay in control, and when he chopped onions too slowly and burned the garlic, I laughed instead of snapping. And when he tasted the sauce and said it needed more kick, I let him experiment. And the result was actually better than anything I had made in weeks. We ate on the floor with candles flickering around us, and he told me about his childhood, about his fears, about his hopes, and I listened, and I shared too, not everything, not yet, but pieces, and he did not flinch when I talked about fear. He just took my hand and said, we all have shadows, but we do not have to live in them. We started going on hikes on the weekends, nothing too intense, just nature trails and wooded paths. And one time we got caught in the rain and danced under the trees like we were kids. And I remembered that feeling of freedom, like no one could touch us. And I wanted to bottle it forever. The more time I spent with Julian, the more I saw what real partnership could look like. Not control, not power games, not fear, but support and patience and laughter. And it scared me sometimes because I still had walls and triggers and wounds that flared without warning. But he never made me feel broken. He just stood with me until the storm passed. Milo loved him even more, and one night, while we were watching a documentary, Milo crawled into Julian's lap and fell asleep, and I knew then that I was not imagining things, that this man was safe. One afternoon, I ran into one of Ryan's old coworkers at the grocery store, a woman named Dana who had always seemed polite if distant, and she asked how I was, and when I said I was doing better, she said, I heard about everything, and I just want you to know I believe you, and I never liked how he talked about you when you were not around, and it shook me because I had spent so long thinking no one noticed that I had been invisible, and maybe I had been to some people, but not to everyone. And her words stayed with me, not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me that even in darkness, someone might still be watching and wishing you well, and that mattered. I started volunteering at the shelter where I had once stayed, helping with intake, talking to new arrivals, stocking supplies and cleaning rooms, and it felt like coming full circle. I met women who were still raw, still shaking, and I listened, and I offered what I could, not solutions, not fixes, just presence and understanding, and sometimes that was enough to help someone breathe a little easier. I never told them my full story, not unless they asked, but they saw it in my eyes that I knew. And one night a girl no older than 19 held my hand and said, you look like someone who made it, and I said, I am still making it every day, and that is the truth. I started sleeping better, dreams less violent, breathing easier. I stopped jumping at doorbells, stopped double-checking the locks every hour. I kept going to therapy. I kept writing. I kept growing. And one day I realized I had not thought about Ryan in over a week, not even once, and it felt like freedom. I hosted a dinner for a few friends, Ava, Julian, Marla, and a couple others I had met at the shelter, and as we sat around my table with candles flickering and dishes passed from hand to hand, I felt surrounded by light, by warmth, by chosen family, and I raised my glass and said, thank you for seeing me and for reminding me who I am, and they all smiled and clinked their glasses, and I knew I was home, not a place, not a building, but a state of being, and I had built it myself, brick by brick, moment by moment, with courage and softness and resilience, and I would protect it with everything I had. It had been almost 6 months since the trial ended, and life had begun to feel different, not perfect, not easy, but breathable. I had a job now, part-time, at a local library, helping with inventory and event planning, and though it did not pay much, it gave me structure and quiet and a sense of value. That was mine alone every morning. I woke up before Milo and made coffee, sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, and listened to the birds. It was a routine that grounded me before the rush of school, drop-off and errands and appointments. And in those still moments I would sometimes think about who I used to be and how far I had come, not in miles, but in soul distance, in the depth of knowing my own strength. Julian had started staying over a few nights a week, and though we never rushed anything, I could feel the way we were becoming a rhythm, and he always asked before touching me, always waited for my nod or my smile, and that made all the difference. One night after Milo fell asleep, we sat on the porch together, sipping tea, and Julian said, "I used to think love had to be loud, dramatic, filled with chaos and big gestures, but now I think real love feels like this, like breathing, like peace." And I did not say anything because I was afraid my voice would crack, but I reached for his hand and held it, and that was enough. I had begun saving money a little at a time, putting away tips from extra hours and gift money and anything spare, because I had a goal. I wanted to finish my degree, the one I had put on hold when Ryan said school was a waste of time. I found my old transcripts online, contacted the university, and after a few emails and phone calls, they told me I could re-enroll with minimal credit loss if I started the following spring. I cried after that call, not because of the opportunity, but because someone on the other end spoke to me like I mattered, like I was capable, like I was not too late. I started preparing, slowly rereading textbooks, watching lectures at night after Milo slept, taking notes, testing myself. I told no one at first, not even Julian, because I wanted it to be mine. I needed it to be something I was doing for me alone, and it felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had not died, just gone quiet, mean. While Ryan had stayed silent, no letters, no calls, no requests for contact, his sentence ensured he would be in prison for at least 7 years. But even that felt too short for what he had done, not just to me, but to my peace, my body, my son. I still had nightmares sometimes, I still flinched at loud voices, but I had learned how to breathe through it, how to ground myself, how to remind my mind that I was no longer there. One afternoon, while volunteering at the shelter, I met a woman named Camille who reminded me of myself. Quiet, twitchy eyes, always scanning the room. She had 2 kids with her, both under the age of 6, and when I helped her carry her bags to her temporary room, she looked at me and whispered, "Does it get better?" And I said, "Yes, not perfect, not all at once, but better." And she nodded. Like that was the first honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. And that night I wrote her a note and slipped it under her door. It said, "I believe you and I see you, and you are not alone, and you are stronger than you think and weak." Later, when she moved to her own place, she handed me that note and said this kept me going, and I knew then why I had survived, not just to escape, but to reach back and pull others out with me. One rainy Saturday, Julian brought over a large cardboard box and said he had found it at a garage sale, and thought of me. Inside was an old typewriter, mint green with round keys, and I laughed because it was beautiful and quirky and completely unnecessary, and I loved it. I set it up in the corner of my living room next to the window, and every evening after dinner I typed poems, not for anyone, not for publishing, just for me, just to hear the click-clack of the keys and feel the rhythm of my thoughts turning into words. Sometimes Milo would sit beside me and ask what I was writing, and I would say stories about brave people, and he would nod like that made perfect sense. One night he asked me, "Mama, are we brave people?" And I said, "Yes, baby, we are," and I meant it with every part of my soul. As winter approached, I enrolled in the spring semester part-time online courses, and when I told Julian, he picked me up and spun me around the living room, shouting, "We are going back to school," and Milo clapped like it was the best news in the world, and I cried because it felt like victory, not loud, not flashy, just steady, determined, full circle. I bought a new notebook, new pens, set up a study schedule, carved out hours between work and parenting and life, and it was hard, but it was worth it. The first time I submitted an essay and got positive feedback, I printed it out and taped it to my fridge like a trophy, not because it was perfect, but because it existed, because I had made it happen. And that mattered more than any grade. My therapist once told me healing is not linear, that it zigzags, that sometimes we sprint and sometimes we crawl, and sometimes we lie flat on the floor and rest. And I had come to understand that deeply, because some days I still felt heavy, still felt the ghost of Ryan in the corners of my home, in the way I flinched at sudden movement or hesitated before answering the phone. I no longer let that weight define me. I carried it differently, like a stone in my pocket, not gone but no longer crushing me. One evening I received a letter in the mail, no return address, but the handwriting was familiar, and my heart raced. I opened it slowly, and it was from Ryan, a single page, apologizing without truly saying sorry, blaming stressed child who'd pain anything but himself. I read it once, then tore it into pieces, flushed them down the toilet, and stood there watching as they disappeared, not out of anger, but closure. I did not need his words to heal. I did not need his permission to be free, and that realization was more powerful than any apology he could have written. Days turned into weeks, winter turned into early spring, and on a breezy March morning I walked Milo to school, and he turned to me and said, "You look happy, Mama," and I smiled and said, "I am," because I was not pretending, not performing. I was living truthfully, gently, and with open hands. I started hosting writing workshops at the shelter, using the typewriter and extra notebooks, teaching women how to put their pain into words, not for anyone else but for themselves, and it became a healing ritual. Every Friday afternoon we would gather in a circle, sip tea, write, and read if we wanted, and some of the stories were so raw, so powerful. They left us all in tears and laughter, and I knew then that survival was not the end goal. It was the beginning, that thriving meant reaching beyond our own wounds to hold space for others. And that is what I was doing, not fixing, not saving, just holding space. And that mattered. I planned a trip for me and Milo to the mountains during spring break, a small cabin near a lake, no screens, no distractions, just trees, birds, and quiet. And when we arrived, he ran across the grass yelling freedom. And I laughed and ran with him, and we spent our days hiking, making pancakes, fishing from the dock. And at night we sat by the fire and told stories, and I wrote long letters to my future self, promising never to forget this peace, this joy, this resilience. On the last night, Milo fell asleep early, and I stepped outside wrapped in a blanket. It looked up at the stars and whispered thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the universe, to my past self, to the women who helped me along the way. And I felt whole, not because I had everything figured out, but because I had reclaimed my voice, my body, my mind, my life. Spring warmed the city slowly, like a whisper moving through the trees, and I found myself stepping into the light more each day. Milo loved the longer days because it meant more time at the park, more time kicking a ball across the field and laughing as he chased after it, and I started letting myself smile more openly, not just polite smiles, but the kind that lived in my chest and reached my eyes. Julian noticed it too, and one evening, while we were washing dishes together, he said, "You are glowing," and I laughed because I felt it too. I had started taking early morning walks again, not fast, not fitness, but for breath, for grounding, for watching the world wake up. I passed old houses with peeling paint, kids waiting for school buses, and elderly couples watering their gardens, and it felt like a world I belonged in, not one I was hiding from. My coursework picked up pace, and I found joy in learning again, in opening textbooks and realizing I understood the material, in submitting essays and getting thoughtful feedback. And even when I was tired, even when I doubted myself, I kept going, because this was mine, this was my second chance, and I would not let it slip away. One Thursday evening I attended a small poetry reading at the library where I worked. It was open mic night, and though I had no intention of reading, I brought my notebook anyway, just in case, and when they asked for one more reader before closing, something in me rose before I could stop it. I stood, notebook in hand, trembling but voice steady, and read a piece about surviving, about the quiet strength of rebuilding. And when I looked up, the room was silent, then someone clapped, then others, and by the end I had tears in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the way strangers held space for my truth. After that I was invited to speak at a local community group for women healing from trauma, and I said yes, because it felt right, because I knew what it meant to sit in those rooms and listen and wish someone would say, "You will make it through." I wore my favorite sweater, the soft one with the sleeves too long, and went. I walked in the room, fell quiet, not in judgment, but in waiting and hope, and I told them my story, not every detail, not every scar, but enough to show the arc of it, the journey. And when I finished, one woman whispered me to, and another said I thought I was the only one, and we sat in a circle, holding hands and crying, and it felt like church, not the kind with pews and sermons, but the kind where truth is sacred and pain is honored. Milo was thriving in school. He made new friends and came home with stories about what so and so said at lunch, or how he won the spelling game, and his laughter filled our home like sunlight, and every time he called me Mama, my heart swelled because I remembered the nights I feared I would not get to see him grow. I started a small blog under a pen name, writing about healing, about motherhood, about starting over, and slowly people found it, commented, shared it, wrote to me saying thank you for putting this into words, and I felt seen, not in the way that demands attention, but in the way that says your voice matters. You are not invisible. Julian continued to be a quiet, steady presence, showing up with groceries when I was too tired, fixing the leaky sink without being asked, reading bedtime stories with voices that made Milo giggle, and though we never pushed labels or timelines, I knew this was love, the kind that does not need to prove itself loud. It simply shows up. One afternoon, while cleaning out the storage closet, I found an old photograph of me and Ryan from the early days before everything changed, and I looked at it for a long time, trying to remember who that girl was, what she believed, what she hoped for. And I did not cry. I simply placed the photo in a box labeled past and slid it under the bed, not to forget but to release. I had learned that closure is not always a door slamming shut. Sometimes it is a window opening, letting the air shift, letting the dust settle. One weekend Julian planned a picnic just for us at the park where we had first met. He brought sandwiches, I brought lemonade, and Milo chased dragonflies while we lay on blankets staring at the clouds, and Julian turned to me and said, I have never been more proud of anyone than I am of you. And I looked at him and said, I am proud of me too. And we lay there in the grass, in the warmth, in the stillness, and I felt safe, not because danger no longer existed, but because I had built something strong within myself, something that could not be shaken by storms or ghosts. One evening, I received a message from a woman named Becca. She said she had stumbled upon my blog and recognized the story, not the names, but the pain, and she asked if we could talk, so we met at a cafe downtown, and she told me about her husband, the isolation, the control, the fear, and I listened without flinching, without fixing, just listened. And when she finished, she asked, what do I do? And I said, you begin with one truth. You begin by believing yourself. And she nodded and gripped her coffee cup like it was the only solid thing in her life, and in that moment I saw myself again, in the reflection of her tears, in the tremble of her voice, and I knew this was the work, not grand, not public, not always acknowledged, but powerful in its own way. I helped her find resources, connect with a counselor, find a safe place to stay, and weeks later she sent me a photo of her and her daughter smiling in their new apartment. And I cried, not because I saved her, but because she saved herself, and I was simply the mirror that showed her she could. I visited my parents more often now, not because things were perfect between us, but because they were trying. My mother apologized again for not seeing, for not asking, for not believing sooner, and I forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because I needed to. And my father hugged me tighter each time we said goodbye, and I knew he carried guilt in his silence, but he was there now, present, helping, fixing things around the house, babysitting Milo, and sometimes that mattered more than words. On the anniversary of the trial, I lit a candle, placed it by the window, and sat in silence, not mourning, not celebrating, just honoring the woman I used to be, the girl who thought she would never escape. And I whispered thank you to her because she kept going, because she fought when I wanted to give up, because without her I would not be here. And the flame flickered like it, understood like it, heard, and I sat there until the wax melted into nothingness, and it felt right. I had stopped asking why things happened the way they did. I had stopped needing every piece to make sense. Instead, I focused on what I could build, on the laughter in my home, on the women I could help, on the son I was raising to be kind, strong, and unafraid of softness. And in that focus I found freedom, a quiet, steady kind that did not need noise to be real. And when I walked down the street, people no longer saw a woman who had survived something terrible. They saw a woman living deeply, and that was enough. The morning began with a heaviness in the air, like something unspoken waiting to fall, and I moved through the house in silence, listening to the small noises that filled the space. Milo humming to himself while brushing his teeth, the sound of the kettle clicking off, the thud of Julian setting down his briefcase by the door, and I looked at them both and realized how normal this life had become, how quiet, how safe, and I held that in my hands like something fragile, something hard-earned, because I remembered the mornings that came before the ones where I flinched at the sound of footsteps, where I measured every breath, where I learned how to speak in ways that would not provoke, and it made me grateful, not in a loud way, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that breathes steady and quiet and lives in the bones. I walked Milo to school, his little hand in mine, and when we reached the gate he looked up and said, "You are the best mama in the world," and I bent down, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "I love you more than the sky," and he ran off, backpack bouncing, and I stood there for a moment watching him disappear into the crowd and feeling the ache of love, that deep, that full. I returned home and sat at the kitchen table staring at the blank page in my journal, the one I saved for letters I would never send, and I began to write to Ryan, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with clarity, with the weight of everything I had carried and survived. I told him about the fear, about the moments that broke me, about the nights I held our son and promised him we would be okay, and I wrote about the trial, about the strength it took to stand in that room and say the truth out loud. I wrote about the silence that followed the quiet, that was not peace but absence. And then I wrote about healing, about rebuilding, about every step I took back to myself, and when I finished I tore the page out, folded it once, and placed it in the fireplace, watching the edges curl, the words burn and turn to ash, and it felt final, not in a way that needed celebration, but in a way that said, "I am done." Carrying this, later that afternoon I received a call from the outreach center where I had spoken months ago. They were organizing a workshop for survivors who wanted to share their stories creatively through writing, art, and performance, and they asked if I would co-lead it, and I said yes without hesitation, because I had learned that storytelling was not just about catharsis. It was about reclaiming power, about turning pain into something useful, something that could light the path for someone else. The first session was held in a sunlit room with wide windows and mismatched chairs, and as women entered slowly, cautiously, I recognized the way they held themselves, guarded eyes, quiet mouths, and I welcomed them with the gentleness I once needed, and we began not with stories, but with breath, with silence, with space, and slowly they began to speak, not all at once, not fully, but enough, and I saw the shift, the softening, the way courage grows in small steps. One woman painted what she could not say, one wrote poems in broken lines that still bled truth, one sang a lullaby from a childhood she had tried to forget. And in each offering there was strength, not polished, not perfect, but real, and it moved me. It reminded me why I stayed, why I kept showing up. Milo had started asking more questions about his dad, about the man in the photos, about why he never came around, and I answered with care, with age-appropriate truth, telling him that his dad made choices that hurt people, that he had to go away for a long time, and that it was not Milo's fault, that it never was, and he would nod slowly, eyes wide, and ask more, and I let him, because silence only breeds shame, and I would not let shame root itself in my son. One evening, while tucking him in, he asked if I missed his dad, and I paused, hand resting on his blanket, and said, "I miss who I thought he was," and that felt true enough. Julian continued to be the quiet current in our lives, steady, present, and never asking for more than I could give, and one evening after dinner, while we were sitting on the porch watching the stars, he took my hand and said, "I love you," and there was no pressure, no weight, just truth, and I looked at him and said, "I love you too," and it felt like opening a door I had long kept closed, not with fear, but with care, and now I was ready to walk through it together. The blog had grown slowly, steadily, and people began to share their own stories in the comments, in emails, in anonymous messages, and it became a community, not curated, not filtered, but raw and real, and I moderated it carefully, creating a space where people felt safe, where they felt seen, and it reminded me every day that survival is not a straight line, is messy, non-linear, and worthy of celebration at every turn. One reader wrote to say she had left her abusive partner after reading one of my entries. Another said my words gave her the courage to speak up for the first time, and I kept those messages printed in a small box under my bed for the day when doubt returned, when the weight felt too much, because healing is not a one-time event. It is a daily choice, a daily fight sometimes, and knowing that my voice mattered helped me choose it again and again. I was invited to speak at a university panel on domestic violence and the legal system, and as I stood on stage looking out at rows of young faces. I remembered my own fear. The day I entered the courtroom, remembered the tremble in my knees, the dryness in my mouth. And I spoke about that. I told them about the system, about the barriers, about the strength it takes just to show up. And when I finished, there was silence, then applause, then questions, thoughtful, urgent ones, and I answered them all not as an expert, but as a witness, as someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. I left the auditorium that day feeling like maybe, just maybe, I was helping change something. Even if just a little. I still had nightmares, sometimes flashes of the worst moments, images that arrived uninvited, but I had learned to breathe through them, to ground myself, to remind my body that the danger was past, that I was safe now, and they came less often, less sharp. And when they did, I no longer let them unravel me. Instead, I wrote, I painted, I walked until the noise quieted. And that too was progress. My friendships deepened, not many, but the few who stayed, who listened, who showed up without judgment. And we shared meals, stories, laughter, and grief, and it felt like family, like the kind you choose, and I cherished them fiercely. One night, while out for coffee with Maya, she said, I hope you know how proud I am of you, and I smiled, because hearing it out loud still mattered, still felt like a balm. And I said, I am learning to be proud of me too. Near the end of that year, I received a letter from the court notifying me that Ryan had filed a motion for early parole, and for a moment the room spun, the past rushing in like a flood. But I steadied myself. I read every line. I called my lawyer. I wrote a statement, and I made it clear that I opposed the motion, that he had not served enough time, that his actions still had consequences. And when the hearing date arrived, I stood again in a room filled with echoes, and I read my words steady, firm. And when the judge denied the motion, I felt relief, not celebration, just relief, because justice sometimes needs to be repeated, to be reinforced, be held up again and again. And I walked out of that building taller than before, and when I got home, Milo ran into my arms, and I held him tightly, whispering, we are safe, we are safe. And he asked why, and I said, because Mama fought and won. And he grinned and said, you are so strong. And I thought, yes, I am, and it felt like a truth. I no longer needed to convince myself of I had become someone I admired, not because I was perfect, not because I had all the answers, but because I kept going, because I chose love over fear, truth over silence, and healing over hiding. The days that followed were filled with small victories and quiet reckonings, and I found myself noticing things I once ignored, the softness of my bed at night, the weight of my son's head resting on my shoulder, the light filtering through the curtains in the morning, and every detail felt sharper, more vivid, as if the world had returned to color after living so long in shades of gray. I continued writing, not just for the blog, but for myself, filling page after page with memories, truths, lessons, and dreams I had once buried, and the act of writing became more than release, it became restoration. Each word I wrote stitched parts of me back together, parts that had been torn, bruised, hidden, and in those pages I found the voice I thought I had lost forever. I started waking up before the sun, walking through the still streets with a cup of tea in my hand, and letting the air fill my lungs, and it felt like prayer, like permission to start again each day from a place of strength, rather than fear. And Milo would wake up shortly after asking for pancakes and cartoons, and I would laugh and say, only if you brush your teeth first, and he would race to the bathroom yelling, challenge accepted. And that was our rhythm, full of joy and noise and normalcy. And one morning, while we sat eating cereal, he asked Mama, do you think monsters are real? And I looked at him for a moment, thinking about all the ways monsters wear human faces, and I said, some are, but we are stronger. And he nodded and went back eating, and that moment stayed with me, because I knew one day he would ask a different version of that question, one about his father, and I wanted to be ready. When that day came, I met with Julian later that week at a community event where local businesses had gathered to raise awareness about abuse prevention and healing, and he had set up a booth for his legal aid work, handing out flyers and answering questions. And when he saw me, his face lit up in that familiar way that always made me feel seen, and he walked over and said, you are glowing. And I laughed, because I had not felt beautiful in years, not really, and we talked about the cases he was working on, the workshop I was leading, and plans for a group fundraiser. And there was ease between us, a rhythm that felt earned and honest, and when he brushed his hand against mine as we parted, it sent a current up my spine, and I realized how much I wanted to reach for him, not out of need but out of choice. Later that evening, I sat with that feeling, letting it settle, not rushing it, and I thought about how love had always felt like a storm, chaotic, unpredictable, but now it felt like a tide, steady, persistent, pulling me gently to shore. I attended a panel hosted by the city's health department where survivors shared stories and professionals discussed policy changes, and I was invited to speak on the emotional aftermath of leaving an abusive partner and how to rebuild. And I stood in front of the audience, heart pounding, hand trembling, and I began by saying, I am not here to give advice, I am here to tell the truth. And I spoke of fear, of survival, of resilience, and I watched as people nodded, wiped tears, and one woman mouthed thank you, and it filled me with purpose, the kind that roots itself deep. And I left that evening with a notebook full of names, contacts, ideas, and a fire to do more. A few days later, I received a letter from a woman named Eliza, who had found my blog after escaping a violent marriage. She wrote about the night she fled with her 3 children, about the shelter that turned her away due to lack of space, and how she slept in her car, clutching her kids and reading my words on her phone. And she said those words reminded her she was not alone, and she asked if I could speak at a local event she was organizing for other survivors, and I said yes without hesitation. And when I arrived, the room was packed, folding chairs filled with women, men, teenagers, and even elders, and the energy in the room was electric, raw. And when Eliza introduced me, she hugged me tightly, whispering, "Thank you for saving me." And I swallowed the lump in my throat, stepped onto the small stage, and began to speak, and what poured out of me was not rehearsed, it was real. And I talked about how healing is not always beautiful, how some days feel like drowning and others like flying. And I said the bravest thing I ever did was tell the truth, and keep telling it even when no one wanted to hear it. And after I finished, they stood and clapped and cried, and many came forward to share their own stories. And I realized this was bigger than me, this was a movement, and I wanted to be part of it fully. Around that time, Julian and I had our first real date, not coffee, not lunch, not passing moments, but an intentional evening just for us. And he picked me up in his car, dressed in a navy shirt and gray slacks, and he looked nervous in the sweetest way. And he handed me a single sunflower, saying, "I know roses are cliché," and I laughed because he was right. And we went to a small bistro with outdoor seating and twinkling lights. And we talked for hours about books, childhood dreams, the way trauma reshapes the brain, and laughter echoed between bites and sips. And when the waiter brought dessert, Julian reached across the table and said, "I have been patient not because I am waiting for you to heal, but because I want to walk with you through every part of that healing, and I want to build something with you that feels like peace." And I felt tears prick my eyes because no one had ever said anything like that to me. And I squeezed his hand and said, "Then let us build it together." And he smiled, and it felt like sunrise. A few weeks later, the shelter where I had stayed during the early days of my escape invited me to help launch a mentorship program, pairing survivors with women currently in crisis. And I accepted and met my first mentee, a soft-spoken woman named Dana, who had 2 small daughters and a shadow behind her eyes I recognized too well. And we met weekly, sometimes over tea, sometimes just walking. And I listened more than I spoke, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer is presence. And slowly she began to bloom. She found part-time work, enrolled in an online course, and started journaling. And one day she handed me a drawing her daughter made. It was a picture of 2 stick figures holding hands, one with curly hair labeled Mommy, and the other with long hair labeled You. And I smiled and hugged her tightly, because healing ripples outward. It touches lives you never expect. I began organizing a city-wide awareness walk, bringing together survivors, organizations, law enforcement, and health professionals, and the turnout was beyond anything I imagined. People carried signs, wore purple shirts, and marched through downtown chanting for justice and change. And at the end, we released lanterns in the sky, each one bearing a name, a story, a hope. And as the lights floated upward, I felt something shift inside me, like closure, like flight. Milo stood beside me, holding my hand, and asked, "Can I make a wish?" And I said, "Of course." And he closed his eyes for a long moment, then whispered, "I wish Mama is always happy, and I kissed his cheek and said that is the best wish I ever heard, and I meant it. One morning, I opened my email to find a message from a national magazine. They wanted to feature my blog in a special issue on resilience and healing, and they asked for an interview and photos, and at first I hesitated because exposure felt vulnerable, but then I thought of the women who found courage in my words, and I said yes, and the article came out a month later with a full-page photo of me and Milo laughing on a park bench, and the title reads Survivor Mother Advocate, and it felt surreal to see myself through that lens, but it also felt earned, and I received letters from all over the country, and even one from Canada thanking me for sharing, for standing, for existing. And I kept every single one in a box wrapped in purple. Ribbon Milo had started drawing more often, and one day he handed me a picture of our house with the sun above it and hearts floating in the sky, and he said this is our safe place, and I cried right there on the floor because it was true, and I had built that, I had made safety from rubble, joy from ruins, and I was not just surviving, I was thriving, and that realization planted itself deep in my soul like a flag that says I was here, I lived, I healed, and I helped. It was a warm afternoon in late spring when the phone rang, and I picked it up expecting a telemarketer or another invitation to speak, but instead it was someone from the district attorney's office, a woman named Carly, whose voice was steady yet kind, and she explained that there had been a new development in the case against my ex-husband, and I felt my heart slow down and then race again, because even after all this time, his name could still trigger something primal in me. She said that due to my testimony and additional evidence uncovered by the detective team, they had found grounds to pursue further charges, and that it would require me to appear in court again, this time not just as a witness, but as someone delivering a formal statement during sentencing, and I sat down slowly holding the phone with both hands, and nodded, though she could not see me, and I said yes, of course, whatever is needed, and when the call ended, I just sat there staring at the wall for a long time before finally getting up and going outside where the air felt too bright and the birds too loud, and I walked for nearly an hour letting my thoughts unravel themselves. I thought I was done with courtrooms, with testimony, with seeing his face from across a room where I had no choice but to relive everything, but I also knew that justice was not a one-time thing, it was a process. And sometimes it asked for more than you wanted to give again and again, and that night I called Julian and told him everything, and he was quiet at first, then said I will be there every step of the way, and he meant it, and the day of the hearing came faster than I expected. I wore a deep blue suit that Dana had helped me pick out from a thrift shop that had recently partnered with our Survivor Fund, and I curled my hair and stood in front of the mirror staring at my own reflection, trying to see the same woman everyone else kept calling strong, brave, powerful. And when I arrived at the courthouse, I was greeted by Carly, who smiled and handed me a folder with the case notes and statement instructions, and we walked through the long marble hallway, my heels clicking with every step, and it felt like a countdown, like a drumbeat, that led me right back to the place where it all began. And when I entered the courtroom, I saw him, my ex-husband, sitting at the defense table, looking thinner, older, but still holding himself with that same arrogance that once fooled me, and for a moment I froze, not out of fear, but out of memory, remembering the first time I saw him, the first time he raised his voice, the first time he broke something, the first time he struck me, and I let that reel of pain play for one final time before I took a deep breath and walked forward. And when the judge called me up, I stood tall holding my statement and looking directly ahead, not at him, not at the crowd, but somewhere firm and steady inside myself. And I read the words I had spent weeks crafting, words that told the truth of what he did, how it affected me, how it nearly broke me, how I rebuilt anyway. And I said, I am not here to beg for punishment. I am here to stand as living proof that he did not win, that he does not define me, and that justice is not only possible, it is necessary. And when I finished, I looked at the judge, who nodded slowly and then dismissed me, and I stepped down feeling 1,000 pounds lighter. Julian was waiting outside the room, and he pulled me into a hug. And for the first time in years, I cried not out of pain or fear, but out of release. And afterward, Carly approached and said, we expect sentencing to be delivered next month, and we will keep you informed. And I thanked her for treating me like a human and not a case file. And when I left the building, the sky was turning orange and purple, and Milo ran up to me holding a drawing he made of our family, and I kissed his forehead and said, "I am proud of you too, baby." Because he had waited patiently with my friend the entire time, and that evening we ordered pizza and watched cartoons, and I let myself just be a mother, and not a survivor for once, just someone sitting on the floor, eating greasy slices and laughing at animated voices, and it felt like something new. Like the beginning of a new chapter. A few days later, I was invited to speak at a regional conference on domestic violence policy reform, and this time I was not just telling my story, I was part of a panel advising lawmakers on what survivors actually need, and I spoke about housing, about protection, about trauma-informed counseling, and I watched them listen, some nodding, some taking notes, and one woman in a gray suit even wiped away tears. And afterward, several attendees approached me saying my words had changed their perspective, and one said, "We always think of statistics, but today you made it human." And I held on to that because changing minds was the first step to changing laws. And later that week, I received an email from a university asking if I would be willing to share my journey with their graduate students in social work, and I agreed. And when I arrived at the lecture hall, it was packed with young faces, eager, scribbling notes, whispering to each other, and I began by saying, "I am not an expert in policy or psychology, but I am an expert in surviving and thriving," and I told them that behind every client file is a person who dreams, who fears, who fights to be whole again, and I told them that sometimes the best thing they can do is believe us, and they applauded, and afterward many stayed behind asking questions, thanking me, and I felt like the seeds I had planted were beginning to grow roots. I had also been working with Eliza to create a monthly support circle for survivors that would rotate locations each month: libraries, churches, community centers, even open parks, and our first gathering was held at a women's wellness center, and we had snacks, soft music, candles, and a rule that said, "Speak if you want, listen if you need," and the stories shared that night were raw and real and sacred, and we cried together, laughed together, and even danced at the end, because healing sometimes looks like celebration. And as the weeks went on, more women joined, and even a few men, and the circle grew into something powerful, a community. And I kept writing every morning before the sun. Sometimes poetry, sometimes essays, sometimes just a single sentence like today, "I am still here." And that was enough. And one day I received a message from a publisher who had read my blog and asked if I ever considered turning my story into a book. And I said yes, though the idea had scared me before. And they offered guidance, editorial support, and even a small advance. And I cried again, because it felt like the universe confirming that my pain had purpose, and that my voice mattered. And I began writing the manuscript in the evenings, after Milo went to bed, pouring my soul into every chapter. When I got stuck, I would read the letters readers had sent me, reminding myself why I started this journey in the first place, and I titled the book "Served with Justice" because it captured exactly what happened that morning after everything. And when the cover design arrived in my inbox showing a woman standing strong in a kitchen apron in one hand, gavel in the other, I laughed and cried and felt every part of my journey reflected there. And when I finally held the printed copy in my hands months later, I whispered, "You did it," and placed it on the shelf where it belonged, next to the journal, the awards, the framed photo of me and Milo at the march. And I knew this was not the end, this was the middle, and it was beautiful. The day my book was released officially in stores and online, I sat on my porch with a mug of tea and stared at the morning sky as the first light of dawn touched the edge of the clouds. And for the first time in what felt like years, I did not feel like I was waiting for something to go wrong. Instead, I was waiting for something beautiful to arrive. And by the time the sun had climbed higher, my phone began buzzing with messages from friends, readers, activists, and even strangers who had read early previews or purchased their copies at midnight. And the messages poured in like a wave of light. People telling me how they cried, how they felt seen, how they were inspired to speak up or leave or heal or even write. And I saved every single one of them in a folder because they reminded me why I had walked through fire to tell my story. And later that afternoon, Julian arrived with a bouquet of Sunflowers and Milo made me a card that said "You are the strongest mommy," and we baked a cake together laughing at how it sank in the middle, and I did not care because the sweetness was already there, and in the evening I held a virtual book launch with over 300 people attending from across the country, and I sat in my living room with a soft light and answered questions and read a chapter aloud. And when someone asked me if I had forgiven him, I said forgiveness is not required to be free. What matters is that I no longer carry his weight, and the chat filled with applause emojis and hearts. And I closed my laptop that night with tears in my eyes and peace in my chest. A few days later, I received a call from a woman named Ava who worked for a nonprofit organization focused on legislative advocacy, and she said, "We want you to help us train our speakers and survivors who want to share their stories effectively and powerfully." And I said yes, because this was no longer just my journey. It was part of something bigger, and I started leading weekly workshops teaching women how to shape their pain into purpose, how to write, how to stand, how to breathe when their voice shook, and I watched them transform from trembling to fierce, from whispering to roaring. And every time one of them stepped onto a stage, or spoke at a council meeting, or published an article, I felt a surge of pride, as if they were my sisters and my daughters, and together we were creating an army of truth-tellers. And as the months passed, I was asked to serve on the advisory board of a major shelter network, helping improve their trauma response policies, and I met with psychologists, legal experts, and former survivors who now worked in leadership, and I realized how much my voice mattered, not because it was special, but because I used it. And I started visiting high schools and colleges, talking about healthy relationships, about warning signs, about consent. And I never held back. I told the truth raw and clear, and students would come up after asking if I thought they should leave their relationship or how to help a friend, and I always said trust your gut and get help and never stay silent. And one day during a campus talk, a young woman stood up and said, "Your story saved my life," and I nearly fell apart, because that was it, that was the reason for everything. And back at home, life had grown softer. My love was now older, more curious, and we had a rhythm of reading every night and baking on weekends. And Julian was steady and kind, helping him with homework, cheering at soccer games, and never once raising his voice. And sometimes I would catch them laughing in the backyard, and it felt like a painting I never thought I would get to hang in my home. And on the anniversary of that morning, the morning I served justice, I woke up early, made breakfast, and sat down with my journal, and wrote a letter to my past self, the woman who stood in the kitchen with a bruised cheek and a silent scream. And I told her, "You did it, you got out, you fought back, you helped others, and you are loved." And I placed the letter in a box with other pieces of that journey, court transcripts, photos, newspaper clippings, and tucked it away because I did not need to relive it anymore. I had lived through it, and that was enough. And in the fall, a producer from a documentary series reached out saying they were doing a feature on women who turned trauma into activism, and they wanted to include my story, and I said yes, but only if they also interviewed others from the circle, because this was not just my voice, it was a chorus. And they agreed, and the crew arrived weeks later, respectful, gentle, asking thoughtful questions. And when they filmed me in the community center during one of our gatherings, they captured not just pain but power, the kind of power that rises from ashes. And when the episode aired, the response was overwhelming. Thousands of messages came in, and I spent days answering as many as I could, each one a reminder that truth multiplies when shared. And that same week, my book hit the bestsellers list, not because of hype, but because people passed it hand to hand saying, "You need this." And a well-known journalist wrote an op-ed saying, "This is not just a story of survival, it is a manual for societal change." And I wept reading it, not out of pride, but out of gratitude, because the echo of my voice had traveled farther than I imagined. And I continue to work at the community center, launching new programs, one focused on financial literacy for survivors, one offering child care support during court appearances, and one pairing survivors with volunteer therapists for short-term trauma relief. And we held a fundraiser gala where survivors shared poetry, monologues, and songs, and I closed the evening with a speech that ended with these words: "We are not broken, we are forged." And the standing ovation lasted for several minutes, and one woman in the crowd came up to me after and said I left last week because of you and my shelter is safe, and I just hugged her and said welcome home, and as the year drew to a close I looked back not with sorrow, but with awe at everything that had bloomed from something meant to bury me, and when the local mayor gave me a recognition award for community leadership, I accepted it holding Milo's hand, and said I accept this not for what happened to me, but for what I chose to do with it, and the crowd stood and clapped, and Milo whispered, "You are famous now, Mommy," and I smiled, and said, "No, baby, I am just loud in the right places." And when we returned home, Julian had hung fairy lights around the porch, and we sat outside sipping cocoa wrapped in blankets, and I told him I think I finally believe it when people say I am strong, and he kissed my hand and said you always were, and in the months that followed I traveled to 3 more cities giving talks, hosting workshops, and expanding our Survivor Circle chapters, and I began working on my second book, this time not a memoir, but a guide for advocates, policymakers, and survivors, and I titled it From Silence to System Change. And when I submitted the first draft to my editor, she called and said this is going to change things, and I believed her because now I believed in myself and the life I had rebuilt brick by brick, tear by tear, voice by voice, and by the next spring I was invited to the state capitol to stand beside lawmakers as they passed a new bill increasing protections and support for survivors. And as the governor signed it into law, he looked at me and said, "Thank you for never giving up," and I smiled with tears in my eyes, thinking not just of myself, but of every woman who ever thought she had no way out, and every man who ever feared speaking up, and every child who needed a safe home to grow. And when I returned home that night, Milo greeted me at the door wearing a tiny suit and holding a paper that said my mom changed the law, and I framed it because it was true. And when I finally went to bed that night, I stared at the ceiling and whispered thank you to the universe, to my past self, to every person who held me up, and I knew that while the pain would never disappear, it no longer ruled me, because justice had been served again and again and again. It had been almost 2 years since the morning I served him breakfast in justice, and yet the memory never dulled, it only took on new meaning as life evolved, and I stood taller not because time healed everything, but because I had filled the space that pain had once occupied with something solid and true. And that morning I was sitting in the quiet of my kitchen sipping a warm cup of coffee when I received an unexpected email from a journalist named Camille, who was writing an investigative series on abuse recovery, and she had come across my book and wanted to include my story in a larger feature focusing on women who had turned survival into community transformation. And after verifying her credentials and seeing the tone of her previous work, which was thoughtful, respectful, and thorough, I agreed to speak with her, and we scheduled a video interview for the following week. And when time came, I sat in my office with a plain background and a soft light and told Camille everything from the beginning, not just the violence, not just the escape, but the rebuilding, the moments of doubt, the strength it took to keep showing up for others even when I still felt raw inside. And Camille asked questions no one else had thought to ask, like what does justice feel like when it is not delivered by a courtroom but by your own hands, and what does forgiveness look like when the other person never asked for it? And I answered with the only truth I had, which was that justice sometimes looked like a clean pillow, a quiet home, and a child who laughs freely, and that forgiveness is not always a door you open. It can also be a wall you build to protect your peace. And when the article was published, the response was even more intense than I expected, not because it was more dramatic than my book, but because Camille had captured something intimate, the quiet triumph that comes after the noise, the resilience that grows in silence. And soon after that piece ran, I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on restorative justice and survivor leadership, and I stood on that stage under bright lights in front of hundreds of social workers, legal professionals, therapists, and survivors, and I told them what no one had told me when I was hiding in my bathroom, that justice is not a single moment, it is a series of choices you make every day to live in your truth and to stop shrinking for anyone else's comfort. And the standing ovation at the end felt like thunder, not because they admired me, but because they saw themselves in me. And in the following weeks, I began hosting my own podcast called Forged from Fire, where I interviewed survivors not just of domestic violence, but of all kinds of trauma, people who had endured and risen, and we talked not only about the pain, but about the path forward, about what joy looked like after the storm, and how healing was not a straight line, but a winding road with beautiful views if you kept walking, and the podcast grew faster than I expected, with thousands of listeners tuning in every week, and emails flooding and saying thank you for making me feel seen and heard and understood. And some guests cried, some laughed, and some sat in silence for a few moments before speaking, and each one left a piece of their soul on recording, and I treated each story like a sacred gift. And one day I received a message from a woman named Priya, who had just fled her abusive marriage and was living in a shelter with her 2 children, and she said, "Your podcast kept me from going back. Your voice was the only one that did not tell me to be strong, but told me that it was okay to be scared." And I listened to that episode 5 times until I believed it, and I cried reading her words, because they reminded me that stories save lives not because they are perfect, but because they are real. And a few weeks later, I received a grant to expand the Survivor Circle into a statewide program, and I hired 3 amazing women from different parts of the state, each with their own journey and passion, and we began building local chapters with resources, mentorship, and legal guidance, and we called it Project Rise because that is what we do. We rise again and again, and in the middle of all this growth, I was still a mother, and every night I tucked Milo into bed and whispered how proud I was of him, and we made it a ritual to share one good thing about our day, and one thing we wished for tomorrow, and one night he said, "I wish more mamas were like you, because then more kids would be safe," and I kissed his forehead and said I wish that too. And on the anniversary of the first podcast episode, we hosted a live recording with a studio audience, and the guest was a well-known author who had been through her own storm, and during the episode, we lit candles for everyone who never got the chance to tell their story, and the room was filled with flickering light and tears and strength. And in the back row, I saw Julian holding Milo in his lap, both of them listening, both of them part of the healing. And I realized how far we had come, not just in distance but in spirit. And in that same season, I began writing articles for national publications about policy, reform, gaps in the system, and survivor-led advocacy. And each time I hit publish, I thought about the woman still hiding in her own home, and hoped my words reached her and told her she was not alone. And during one radio interview, I was asked what I would say to my former husband if he were listening, and I paused, took a breath, and said nothing, because he is no longer the center of my story, I am. And the host went quiet for a moment, then said, "That is the most powerful answer I have ever heard." And the calls that came after were all from women thanking me for reminding them that they are allowed to reclaim their own narrative. And one caller said, "I thought I needed him to apologize, but I just needed to stop waiting," and those words stayed with me. And as summer turned to fall, I was invited to meet with members of Congress to discuss survivor support funding, and I sat at a long table with officials in suits and shared not just statistics but stories that had names and faces and families, and I asked them to stop treating survivors like broken things and start treating them like future leaders. And I left that meeting knowing we had made a crack in the wall, and it would keep growing. And back home, the podcast team had doubled, and we began translating episodes into other languages to reach more communities, and the book was now part of the curriculum. Several social work programs and a university invited me to teach a guest lecture series on narrative and justice. And each time I stood in front of those students, I thought about how I once thought my life was over, and now it was being studied as proof of what was possible. And one night, while walking home from the center, I looked up at the sky and saw a shooting star, and I closed my eyes and wished for every woman who had ever thought it was her fault to find the truth that it never was. And a few weeks later, I ran into Nora, the neighbor who once left that note on my doorstep, and she hugged me tight and said, "I always knew you were going to do something big." And I laughed and said, "I just wanted to survive, but thank you for seeing me." And she smiled and said, "You did more than survive. You created a whole path for others to follow." And as the year ended, we held a celebration for Survivor circle, and over 100 people came, each one a testament to what happens when you plant seeds of truth. And I stood on that stage and said, we are not here because we were saved. We are here because we saved ourselves, and we are still saving others every day. And the applause was not just for me, it was for everyone who dared to speak, to stand, to rise. And I knew then that no matter what happened next, I had already done what I was meant to do. And as I walked off that stage, Milo ran up and hugged me and said, Mommy, you are a hero. And I whispered, no, baby, I am just someone who decided not to stay silent. And that made all the difference. The new year arrived quietly, with no grand celebrations or loud resolutions, just a soft understanding that I had survived another cycle, and I was still here, breathing, building, and creating. And the Survivor Center had now expanded into 3 new cities, with each location led by women who once thought they would never lead anything again. And watching them run workshops, manage crises, and train others reminded me of how much power had always lived inside us, just waiting for the right conditions to ignite. And we started monthly storytelling night called Rise and Speak, where anyone could come and share a piece of their story, not just the tragedies, but also the quiet victories, like finally sleeping through the night, or laughing without guilt, or walking into a grocery store without fear. And one night, a woman named Carmen stood up, her voice trembling, and said, I have not spoken about what happened to me in almost 15 years, but tonight I want to take my voice back. And the entire room stood with her, not because she needed validation, but because we all knew the weight of silence and how much it takes to break it. And back at home, Milo was thriving more than I could have imagined. He joined a school drama club and landed the lead in their spring play, and I still remember sitting in the front row holding a bouquet of flowers as he stepped onto the stage in his little costume and delivered his lines with more confidence than I had ever seen. And when the curtain fell, he ran into my arms and said, did I do good, Mommy? And I told him, you did amazing, and I meant every word. And at night, when we cooked dinner together, he would ask questions like, how did you get so strong? And I would answer with the truth, I got strong because I had to, and because I wanted to be someone you could look up to. And he would nod like he understood more than a child should, and maybe he did, because children who witness pain also witness courage. And as spring rolled into summer, the center hosted its first national summit with guest speakers, policy makers, and survivor leaders. And I gave the opening speech with trembling hands and a steady heart, telling them that our stories were not just sad tales, they were blueprints for change. And after the event ended, I received a call from a publishing house interested in turning my podcast and work into a memoir with a broader scope, one that could reach more readers around the world. And although I hesitated at first, worried that reopening old wounds would set me back, I eventually said yes, because I realized that healing and telling the truth are not opposites, they are partners in survival. And over the next 6 months, I wrote during the early mornings and late nights, carving time between meetings, school pickups, and center emergencies. And I poured everything into those pages, not just my story, but the voices of every woman who had passed through our doors. And when the draft was complete, I cried. Not because it was over, but because it felt like something new was beginning. And the publisher set the release date for the following spring and began preparing a nationwide tour. And I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, practicing how I would answer questions that dug into the darkest corners of my life. And each time I reminded myself, you are not broken, you are not a victim, you are not a cautionary tale, you are the proof that survival can be power. And in the middle of all this growth came a moment I never expected, a letter addressed to me in handwriting I did not recognize. And when I opened it, my breath caught, because it was from his sister, the same sister who had once turned her back on me and called me a liar. And inside was a 2-page apology, not just for not believing me, but for allowing herself to be blind to what was always there. And she wrote that after my story became public, she started seeing cracks in her own marriage, ones she could no longer ignore, and that she had left last year and was now in therapy and learning what real love should feel like. And she thanked me not for being brave, but for showing her what bravery looked like. And I sat with that letter for a long time, unsure how to feel, because forgiveness is complicated and memory is not always linear. And eventually I wrote her back, not with judgment, but with boundaries, telling her I was glad she found her way, but that I was still on mine, and we do not have to walk together to wish each other well. And a few months later, I was invited to speak at a university overseas, and I flew for the first time in years, nervous and excited and unsure of how my words would translate across cultures. And yet, when I stood in that auditorium and looked out at the faces of students, activists, and community workers, I realized that pain is universal, and so is resilience, and the applause was not for my past, but for the possibility of every future. And when I returned home, Milo ran into my arms and said, "I missed you," and I said, "I missed you too." And he asked, "Did they like your story?" And I said they loved it, because it reminded them that even when things fall apart, we can rebuild and stronger than before. And in that season, I also reconnected with Julian in a deeper way, not just as co-parents or friends, but as two people who had been through separate storms and had come out the other side with new skin. And we talked late into the night, sometimes about everything and nothing, and one evening he asked me if I ever thought about love again. And I told him honestly, I do, but it looks different now. Love for me is about safety, softness, and being seen without having to bleed. And he nodded and said, that is the kind of love I want too. And we did not rush anything, we just let it unfold one moment at a time with kindness and care. And the memoir release day finally arrived, and I held the finished book in my hands, its cover, a soft matte texture, with bold letters that read "Forged from Fire," and inside were chapters that told not only what had happened, but who I had become, and bookstores hosted readings, and readers stood in line to say thank you, and one woman whispered, "You wrote what I could never say," and another said, "Your voice saved my life." And at night I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, letting those words sink in, letting myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I had done something that mattered. And that summer, we hosted a community mural project where survivors painted their stories on a long wall near the center, and each brushstroke was like a heartbeat, and when it was finished, it stretched across the block with color and emotion and declarations like "I am not what happened to me," and "Love does not hurt." And I remember standing there next to Carmen and Nora and Priya, and dozens of others, all of us holding paint-stained hands and teary eyes, and feeling like this was what justice looked like, not punishment, but creation, not revenge, but rebirth. And in the fall, I received an award from a national foundation recognizing the center as a leading model for trauma-informed community support. And I wore a simple dress and spoke from the heart, saying, "We are not saviors, we are not saints, we are just survivors who decided to reach back and pull others forward." And the applause echoed long after I stepped off the stage, and I carried that sound with me into winter, and the days grew shorter, but the work never slowed, and I found peace in routine, in helping Milo with homework, in planning new programs, in reading letters from women who found hope in our work. And I realized that healing is not always loud, sometimes it is quiet and steady, like a candle that never goes out. And as the year came to a close, I stood on my porch watching snow fall, and whispered a thank you to the version of me who had once thought she could never make it out, who had once been afraid to speak, to breathe, to exist. And I whispered, "Thank you for not giving up, because now look what we have built, look what we have become." And inside the house, laughter echoed and warmth filled every room, and justice was not a single moment, it was every single day I chose to live fully and freely without fear. And that was the kind of justice no one could take from me. As winter slowly melted into spring, I found myself walking more often just to feel the air shift around me, and to remind myself that the world kept turning even when my heart once felt frozen. And the city streets were no longer places I avoided. Instead, they had become my rhythm and my meditation, and every corner reminded me of how far I had come, and how nothing could drag me back to where I once was. And the center expanded its services once again, now including legal workshops taught by volunteer attorneys who once watched survivors from a distance, but were now offering to stand beside them in courtrooms. And every day I saw someone new walk through those doors, scared, exhausted, sometimes completely silent. And I knew what that silence meant. It was the sound of someone still deciding whether they were allowed to want more, and we never rushed them. We never asked them to be brave before they were ready. We just gave them the space to breathe, to exist, to be believed. And one afternoon, a woman named Danielle arrived, holding nothing but a backpack and a toddler clinging to her side, and her eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that words cannot reach. And I offered her tea in a quiet room, and eventually she whispered that she had not slept for more than 3 hours at a time in almost 3 years, and that her husband told her that she was lucky to even be breathing, and we listened, and when she cried, we cried with her, and when she sat in silence, we sat with her, and when she finally said, "I want out," we said, "Then we begin now," and that night our shelter had one more bed filled, and one more woman who would not be going back, and in those moments I remembered my own escape, the cold morning, the shaking hands, the silence that followed the slamming door, and I never forgot what it took to walk away, and I never forgot what it took to stay gone, and Milo was now growing faster than I could track with shoes that seemed to shrink every few weeks, and questions that grew deeper and more thoughtful, and one night he asked me, "Why do some people hurt the ones they love?" And I paused not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it right, and I told him sometimes people are hurting inside so much that they try to control others instead of healing, and sometimes people confuse love with power and fear, but real love, Milo, real love never makes you afraid to be yourself. And he looked at me and nodded slowly like he was storing that truth somewhere deep, and I hoped it would stay with him always. And the podcast series I started had now reached more than 1 million listeners, and every week I received messages from people around the world sharing how one episode helped them leave, or how hearing a story helped them understand their sister or their friend or themselves, and the reach was growing faster than I could have imagined, and publishers were now requesting a second book, this time focused on the stories from the center and the collective power of women, who rebuild not just their own lives but entire communities, and I agreed under one condition, that we include the voices of women directly, not just through me, and they said yes, and we started gathering interviews, recording audio, and piecing together something that felt more like a movement than a memoir. And meanwhile, Julian was still a steady presence in our lives, kind, thoughtful, always respectful of boundaries, but also there when I needed someone to talk to about parenting, about grief, about hope, and we had settled into a rhythm that felt like peace, and there were days we would cook dinner together while Milo told us about his school day, and I would catch Julian watching us with quiet contentment, and I wondered if maybe this was the kind of family I had always deserved, one built not on obligation, but on choice. And one morning, a journalist reached out asking if I would be open to participating in a national televised panel on domestic violence, and at first I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to sit on a stage under bright lights and dissect the worst moments of my life for a viewing audience, but then I thought of Danielle and Carmen and Priya and every woman who had ever whispered "thank you" into my ear, and I said yes, and the day arrived with all its nerves, and I sat beside other survivors and experts, and we told the truth without flinching, and when the host asked me what justice looked like, I answered without blinking, "Justice is waking up without fear. Justice is raising a child who has never seen his mother cry herself to sleep. Justice is knowing that my story can help someone else write a new one." And after the panel, I received another letter, this time from someone I never expected, his mother, and inside was a photograph of a younger version of him holding a newborn Milo, and her words were laced with pain, but also remorse, and she wrote that she had stayed silent too long, had believed him too easily, and had failed both me and her grandson, and she asked if one day she could meet Milo again, and I held the letter for a long time because forgiveness is never simple and memory never linear, and I did not know what the right answer was, but I wrote back eventually telling her that while I appreciated her honesty, our healing had been built in her absence, and if she wanted to know Milo, she would have to respect the boundaries we lived by. And for once I felt no guilt in drawing that line, only peace, and the center now had a wait list for volunteers and applications for internships, and even small donations from high school bake sales and community art shows, and it reminded me that when people are given a cause they believe in, they show up, they give what they can, and they stay. And one evening we hosted a gratitude gala, not to raise funds, but simply to celebrate everyone who made our work possible, and the room was filled with survivors, allies, staff members, and community leaders, and I stood on stage and told them this is not my story alone, it is all of ours, and every time one of you shows up, we write another page together. And after the applause died down, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes and said, "I came here tonight planning to donate, but I am leaving with the courage to leave, and that was worth more than any check." And as the season changed again, I found myself planting a garden in the backyard, small pots at first with herbs, and then vegetables and flowers. And Milo helped me dig and water, and we watched things grow slowly day by day, and one afternoon he looked at me and said, "Mommy, you are like this garden." And I asked him, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You used to look sad, but now you look alive." And I hugged him tightly, feeling the truth of his words in my bones, and I realized that healing is not always loud or fast. Sometimes it is in the soft rhythm of routine, the quiet joy of sunlight and soil. And as I prepared for the next year, I knew that my work was far from over, but I also knew that I was no longer running on fumes, no longer surviving day but living fully and intentionally, and that kind of life was its own kind of justice. And even if the world never gave me an apology, I had built something better. I had built a legacy, and that legacy lived not just in the books or broadcasts or buildings, but in every life that had been changed. Every voice that had been found, and every woman who now believed she was worthy of peace. The year had rounded a full circle, and as I looked back, I could hardly recognize the woman I used to be, because now I stood taller, walked steadier, and breathed with ease I never thought I would feel again. And it was a slow but powerful process of becoming whole, not because the pain had vanished, but because I had refused to let it define me anymore. And I saw that in how I smiled more freely, or how I no longer shrank at sudden noises, or how I could look in the mirror without second-guessing what I saw. And there was a peace in that, a quiet strength that spoke louder than the screams that used to echo inside me. And one morning, after Milo had left for school, I sat alone at the kitchen table, sipping my tea and watching the sunlight fall through the window, and it hit me how this very room once felt like a cage, but now it was simply a kitchen, just a space to nourish, just a place where I could start my day without fear. And that was a victory no one could take from me. And I had finally changed the locks on every door, not just in my house, but in my life. And around that same time, I was asked to speak at a university event for International Women's Day, and they wanted me to talk about the intersection of trauma and resilience, and how survivors rebuild. And I agreed, because the next generation needed to hear the truth from someone who had lived it, and not just read about it. And when the day arrived, I walked onto that stage with a steady heart and a clear voice, and I told them that healing is not a destination, it is a practice, and it is messy and inconsistent and absolutely possible. And I told them that justice is not always delivered in courtrooms, sometimes it is found in the quiet choices we make every day to live free. And I saw nodding heads and teary eyes, and I knew my words had landed. And afterward, a young woman approached me and whispered, "I think you just saved me." And I hugged her gently and said, "Then we are both doing better than we think." And that night I walked home beneath a sky filled with stars, and for once I felt like I belonged under them. And Milo had been learning about justice in his school civics class, and he asked me over dinner what justice meant to me, and I paused, and then I told him justice is safety, it is knowing you are not alone, and that people who hurt you cannot control you anymore. And he nodded in that serious way of his, like he was building something inside. And I hoped that when he grew up he would never forget what I taught him, not just in words, but in how I lived. And meanwhile, the women at the center were blooming in ways that lit up the whole building, and we had started a mentorship program, pairing new arrivals with those who had been there longer, and the results were more powerful than we imagined, because healing in community created a chain reaction of strength, and one woman who had arrived unable to look anyone in the eye was now leading self-defense classes, and another was studying to become a counselor, and another had opened her own hair salon in the neighborhood. And we celebrated each victory, no matter how small, because every step forward was a rebellion against what tried to destroy us. And Julian continued to be our steady friend, always kind, never overstepping, always listening, and sometimes he would join us for game nights or help fix something around the center, and he never made a show of his help, just did what needed to be done and left space for everyone to shine. And I realized that good men exist not because they say they are, but because of how they show up and how they treat others when no one is watching. And one day, I received a letter from a woman who had heard my podcast and had used it as a lifeline through her own escape, and she now wanted to volunteer at the center because she said it saved her, and now she wanted to be someone else's reason to keep going. And we welcomed her with open arms, and I saw the same fire in her that once lived quietly in me. and it reminded me that healing creates ripple effects far beyond what we can measure, and around that time my publisher finalized the second book deal, and I signed the contract with steady hands and a clear vision that this one would be about us, not just me, but the we that survived together and rose together. And I interviewed dozens of women, each with a story that broke and rebuilt me all over again, and together we created something raw, real, and unapologetically true. And when the first advance check came in, I used part of it to fund new emergency housing for the center, because no woman should ever have to sleep in her car or risk returning to danger just because a safe bed was out of reach. And the other part, I used to take Milo on a trip to the mountains where we hiked and roasted marshmallows and laughed until our bellies hurt, and I watched him run through wildflowers and thought, this is what freedom looks like, this is what love should feel like. And on the drive back, he told me, Mommy, this was the best week ever, and I held his hand and said, we will have many more like it, and I meant it with all my heart. And when we returned, I found an invitation waiting in the mailbox from a national conference on survivor leadership asking me to be their keynote speaker, and I accepted, because every time I stood on a stage, I was taking space back from the silence that once held me hostage, and every word I spoke was another brick in the foundation of the future we were building. And at the conference, I shared not just my journey, but the journeys of all the women who trusted me with their truths, and I reminded the audience that survivors are not statistics. We are stories still being written, and they stood to their feet in applause, not for me, but for the movement we were creating. And when I walked off stage, a woman in her 60s took my hand and said, I left last week because of your podcast, and it is not too late for me. And I said, it is never too late to begin again. And her tears matched mine. And in that moment, I knew that everything I had suffered, everything I had survived, had become part of something larger. And back home, the center threw a small celebration for the release of the book. And Milo stood beside me, proud and beaming, as I read aloud the dedication for every woman who dared to say enough, and for every child learning that love is never supposed to hurt. And when I finished, the room erupted in cheers, and I felt more whole than I ever had in my entire life. And later that night, Milo crawled into my bed and whispered, Mommy, you are my hero, and I kissed his forehead and said, you are mine too. And we fell asleep that way, wrapped in warmth and peace, and the quiet certainty that we were safe and we were loved, and that everything we had walked through had brought us here, not just to survive, but to live fully and without fear. And that was the kind of justice no court could ever grant, because it was earned, and it was real, and it was ours. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened that made me realize just how far I had come, and how the scars of the past no longer had the power they once did. And it started with a phone call I almost did not answer, but something in me said, pick it up, and I did, and the voice on the other end was tired, cracked, and hesitant, and it took me a second to register it. But once I did, I froze, because it was him, the man who used to call me wife, the man who once believed he owned my breath and my bones and my every move. And he said my name, and I did not reply. I just let the silence stretch, and finally he said, I am sorry. And I never thought I would hear those words from him, not because they made anything right, but because they revealed something I never expected, which was that he had been forced to look in the mirror and face the truth of who he had been. And I waited, and he continued, I know nothing I say can fix what I did, but I am trying to change. And I needed to say it out loud to the one person I hurt most. And I still did not speak, because I owed him nothing, not even my forgiveness. And after a while he added, I am in therapy now, and part of the process is making amends, and I do not expect anything from you. I just wanted to say I am sorry. And I closed my eyes and felt nothing, no rage, no pain, no fear. And that was the miracle, because the girl who once trembled under his roof was gone, and in her place stood a woman unmoved by his voice. And I said, I hope you continue to change, but this conversation is not for me. And then I hung up and exhaled deeply and realized that was closure, not the apology itself, but the power to walk away from it without needing more. And I did not tell anyone about the call, not because I was hiding it, but because it did not belong to anyone else. It was mine and mine alone, and the fact that I handled it without unraveling was a kind of justice all on its own. And a few days later, I took Milo to the park, and as he ran ahead with his backpack bouncing, I sat on the bench watching the golden leaves fall like whispers from the trees, and a woman next me smiled and said, "You look peaceful," and I said, "I am," and it was the truth because peace no longer felt like a stranger, and around that same time, our center received a surprise grant large enough to expand and renovate the space, and when the team told me, I laughed with joy and cried with gratitude. And we immediately began planning and sketching and dreaming bigger than we ever had. And when the new wing opened, we named it the Second Sunrise, because that is what healing felt like. And at the ceremony, I stood in front of a small crowd and spoke about the day I first walked through those doors, bruised and unsure, and how those same doors now opened wider for the next woman, the next family, the next survivor. And I told them, we do not just rebuild, we rise. And when I finished, Milo clapped the loudest and shouted, "That is my mom," and everyone laughed, and I held him close and whispered, "I am proud of us," and I meant it deeply and completely. And in the months that followed, I kept writing, kept mentoring, kept living. And one evening, as I tucked Milo into bed, he asked, "Will we ever be scared again?" And I said, "Probably, but that does not mean we are not safe." And he nodded slowly like he was letting that sink into his little soul, and then he asked, "Did Dad ever say sorry?" And I paused and said yes. And then he asked, "Did you forgive him?" And I said, "I forgave myself, and that is what matters most." And he looked at me with such wide understanding that I almost could not believe he was still so young. And he said, "I think you are brave," and I said, "I think you are stronger than you know." And we turned off the light, and I listened to his breathing, and felt the kind of calm that comes when you know you are exactly where you are meant to be. And the next morning, as sunlight poured through the windows, I made breakfast like I always did, and as I cracked the eggs and buttered the toast, I thought about the title of my first book, and how some people found it provocative or shocking, and how others called it powerful and bold. And the truth is, it was all those things and more, because that breakfast was not just about food, it was about reclaiming my role in my own story, about serving justice with my own hands, and refusing to stay silent. And now every meal I made in peace was a continuation of that same justice. And one weekend, Milo and I planted a small garden behind the house, and we named each plant after a virtue: patience, courage, hope, growth, and love. And every morning we watered them together and watched them stretch toward the sun, and that became our ritual, our grounding. And when the flowers began to bloom, Milo said, "See, Mom, they are not scared to grow." And I smiled and said, "Neither are we," and it was the most honest thing I had spoken in a long time. And as the seasons changed and time moved forward, I kept walking this path one steady step at a time, not looking back with anger, but ahead with purpose. And I began teaching writing classes for other survivors, helping them shape the pain into power, helping them find the words that would carry them into the light. And I watched women discover their voices on the page, and it was holy, it was sacred, and I knew in my bones that storytelling was a revolution. And my second book climbed to the top of the bestseller list, not because of me, but because of what it represented, which was truth and transformation and sisterhood and healing. And on the night it hit #1, Milo and I danced in the living room with the lights off and music blaring, and we laughed until we collapsed on the couch, breathless and happy. And I told him, "This is what victory looks like," and he nodded and said, "It looks like home." And I kissed his cheek and whispered, "You are my greatest chapter." And years from now, when he is grown and telling his own stories, I hope he remembers not just what we survived, but how we rebuilt, how we lived, how we loved without fear, and how we never gave up. And maybe one day when someone asks him, "What does justice look like?" he will say, "It looks like my mother and her garden, and the way she turned every scar into something beautiful." And then he will smile the way only those who have seen darkness and chosen light can smile. And the world will be better for it. And I know I cannot rewrite the past, but I have rewritten the ending, and that is enough, and that is everything. Outro: this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.